The top 2% of the population controls between 50 and 67% of the annual wealth. Bureaucrats, managers, other professionals work very hard, struggling to secure their positions and maybe, hopefully, advance their standard of living bit by bit. Political office is often a source of revenue in a world where everything is for sale, including justice, favors, and influence. People who work to produce the goods sold at exorbitant markup don't receive any of the wealth they generate for those at the top. Farmers and day laborers who grow and harvest food often themselves do not have enough to eat. Many people are struggling every day just to get by. This is New Testament scholar William Herzog's analysis of the social situation into which Jesus spoke parables, like the one we heard this morning. Of course, theirs was an agrarian society with a different political structure, but so much of this sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? If you are confused by today's parable, you are not alone. In fact, this is one of the most debated parables. Scholars don't even agree where the parable itself ends. Which pieces are the master's words in the story? Which are Jesus' interpretation of the story? And which are Luke, the gospel writer's gloss on the story? And yet this parable was remembered and repeated by the early Christians enough that it got written down and preserved because it spoke into their culture. And this living word continues to speak into ours today. It might help if we remember that parables are not one-to-one analogies or allegories. They're not simple moral lessons with a neat take-home message tied up in a bow at the end. Parables help us to see the world and our place in it from a different perspective or a new light. They often work by either getting us to identify with a character and then revealing something about them, or by eliciting an emotional or moral reaction that is then turned back on ourselves. There's not one answer or solution to parables, but there's lots of truth in them. Let's walk through it again. There was a rich man, a member of the elite, who employed a manager. This manager was a kind of representative, the face of the often absent landlord to the peasants with whom they needed to do business. So this rich man hears that his manager is squandering his property. I wonder who he hears this from, and who benefits from getting the manager out of the picture. So he calls the manager and says, "You can't be my manager anymore, and I want to see the accounting books." Now, the manager doesn't seem to argue. He doesn't protest that the claims are false. Is this because he's guilty? Or because he knows that trying to pit his word against someone else's just isn't going to get him anywhere? But at the prospect of losing his livelihood, the manager goes over his options. He's not strong enough for manual labor, and he doesn't want to be without any work at all. And here's where the story gets really interesting, at least to my hearing. The manager goes to the people in his master's debt. They may have been tenants who were working the land, or merchants who the landowner contracted with to buy crops from the farm and sell them in the market. The manager has not lost his job yet. As far as these peasants know, he is acting on behalf of the rich man. "How much do you owe?" he asks the first. 100 measures of oil. "Let's rewrite that bill for 50, he says. And again with the second, "How much do you owe?" 100 measures of wheat. "Okay, let's rewrite it for 80. And then the rich landowner commends the manager. The dishonest or unjust manager is praised for being shrewd. That is, prudent, sensible, even wise. What's your reaction to this? I feel baffled and maybe a little indignant. Why is the manager being commended for lying, changing a contract to say people owe less than was agreed? What's that all about? I wonder if my own social location changes how I hear this. Or, in other words, if my own service to wealth is showing in my reaction. Because I think if I was a peasant farmer or a paycheck-to-paycheck merchant, that my response to the renegotiated contracts would be, "Thanks be to God." These amounts, 100 measures of oil or wheat, represent somewhere between 3 to 7 years' wages. A 20 to 50% debt reduction would be a massive relief, chipping away at the huge burden under which they work and live every single day. I would think, who cares why this is happening? It sounds like hope, and it feels like justice rolling down. Herzog suggests that the rich man commends the manager because this master realizes he has been backed into a corner. See, these contracts were tricky. Charging interest was against the law. So, rather than spelling out interest rates, bills were simply written for more than had been borrowed. Managers were responsible for setting up these contracts to make money for their masters. They'd be fired if they did not bring in sufficient income for the landowner. But they were also the ones culpable if a contract was challenged and found to be in violation of the law against interest. A rich master could protest innocence and claim to have nothing to do with such practices. Interest was therefore legally hidden, though extraordinarily high. Scholars think that commodities that carried the potential to be diluted, like oil, carried a hidden interest rate of around 50%. Crops that were somewhat easier to inspect, like wheat, might have carried a more modest rate of 20%. Take your bill and write it for 50. Take yours and write it for 80. It seems that the manager is using this moment to expose the system from within. He removes the illegal interest from these debtors' accounts. He chooses a different ultimate master. Instead of using this moment to prove his value with some kind of scheme that might have created even more wealth for the landowner, the manager cunningly used his position to bring debt relief. The especially shrewd part is that he does it on the master's behalf. The debtors will praise the landowner, thinking him a generous and benevolent master. It would be hard, if not impossible, for the rich man to go back and insist on the original higher amount without scandal. He's being forced to be honest and just, and looks good doing so. And so the master's commendation. Touché. Well played. One of the things I hear in this parable is a recognition of the reality that we live and function within a system of exploitation. Jesus' first hearers did as we do now. As followers of Christ, we pray and trust that there will one day be a wholesale reordering of society, the end of all oppression and injustice. Right now, we begin by finding moments where radical redistribution is possible. By being more honest or generous than expected. By making decisions based on a different bottom line. By relieving someone's burden or speaking the truth with whatever platform we have. It is in small, everyday decisions that we choose which master to serve. It is sometimes in a moment or a single relationship that we become bearers of justice or witnesses to hope. So then, friends, let us be faithful even with what seems like very little. We might begin to fix our broken systems rather than simply being a part of them. And choice by choice, moment by moment, we will build a new economy and truly become servants of God.